Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give it a minute or two for people to log on, and then we'll get started. Thank you. A very good evening to those in India and the East. Good afternoon to Europe, and good morning to those waking up in the United States. My name is Rudra Chaudhuri. I'm the director of Carnegie India. It gives me great pleasure in welcoming you to the fifth in our India and the World webinar series on and around COVID-19. We at Carnegie India are committed to bring to you top-line analysis based on deep and collaborative research, especially in this time of a complex health emergency. The pandemic has deepened the fault lines across issues around globalization, international cooperation, global trade, the potential for factor market reforms, the future of work, the import of technology, the balance between privacy and contact tracing, the role of the international and the rise of the national. These are only some of the areas of interest that our scholars and research teams investigate and explore. Our work on COVID-19 is organized in a dedicated webpage accessible through our website, carnegieindia.org. Today's webinar is titled Coronavirus and the Future of Indian Foreign Policy. There is no playbook for diplomatic engagement in the era of social distancing, as much as there is a need in all countries to use the tools of the state to protect home populations, slow down the spread of this virus, and ideally do what is necessary to convert anxiety and disquiet in these less certain times into empathy and compassion. There are equally challenges in the international to find the right balance in the pursuit of fast evolving interests. Terms like deglobalization, supply chain diversification, and sovereignty are used more often than not to ends that are not entirely clear. The intellectual managers of international relations prescribe that the world will be less open, less prosperous, and less free, that we are headed for a poorer, meaner, and smaller world. But do these prescriptions actually hold up? To be sure, it's too early to tell, but perhaps the practice of COVID diplomacy, at least in the immediate, also shows how countries are more ready than otherwise believed to work together, cooperate, share, and challenge the intellectual analysis of where we are and where we might be heading. From the outset, and in the case of India, the government has declared that in the near future, Indian ships and airplanes would have distributed much needed medical supplies to more than 123 countries. For the most part, and arguably, the government has taken the higher road and stayed clear of the schoolyard-like one-upmanship between the US and China. Yet, unexpectedly, crucial questions remain. How will India find the right equilibrium and space in this era of intensifying Sino-American competition? With US President Donald Trump only today arguing that the US could cut off the whole relationship with China, what would an Indian pivot look like? Are there new multilateral partnerships that India needs to consider in this time of shifting geopolitics? Does the current health emergency actually affect India's relations with Pakistan? Are we collectively overemphasizing the effects of this crisis on the broader and system-led definitions of global politics? To examine these questions and fault lines and to give us a clearer picture of what really are the challenges in the present and the extent to which the experiments with foreign policy will pay off, we're joined by a very special set of speakers, Ashok Malik, Suhasini Haidar, Vijay Chauthaiwale, and Indrani Bagchi. Ashok Malik is a policy advisor in the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. In this capacity, he works closely with the External Affairs Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and the leadership of the MEA. Prior to his role, or his current role, from August 2017 to July 2019, Ashok was Press Secretary to the President of India, the first person from outside the civil services to be appointed to the post. He was part of the president's core group of political advisors and functioned as his principal speechwriter and spokesperson. Before joining government, Ashok was a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. He is in New Delhi, one of India's leading public policy think tanks. He's also a distinguished journalist. Suhasini Haidar is the national editor and diplomatic affairs editor of The Hindu, one of India's oldest and most respected national dailies. Prior to this, Suhasini was foreign affairs editor and prime time anchor for India's leading 24-hour English news channel, CNN-IBN, where she presented the signature show Worldview. She is the recipient of the Prem Bhatia Award, a prestigious honor in Indian print journalism. Dr. Vijay Chauthaiwale is in charge, Department of Foreign Affairs in the Bharatiya Janata Party. In this role, he is responsible for coordinating with the Indian diaspora through a global platform of BJP supporters, Overseas Friends of BJP, which has more than 40 chapters worldwide. Vijay is actively involved in coordinating community receptions for Prime Minister Modi across the globe. Additionally, he interacts with foreign embassies, diplomats, delegates of various countries to put forward party perspectives on issues of mutual interest. He is a member of the Atal Innovation Mission, which is an umbrella body under the Niti Aayog, a member of the Board of Governors of IIM Raipur and IISER Pune, and a member of Research Council of CSIR CDRI Lucknow. Vijay has a PhD in microbiology from the University of Pune. He has worked in senior management roles in pharmaceuticals and in R&D for over 18 years. Indrani Bagchi is the diplomatic editor of the Times of India. Indrani covers daily news on foreign affairs, the Foreign Office, as well as interpreting and analyzing global trends with an Indian perspective. She covers India, the US, China, Pakistan, terrorism, nuclear weapons, and national security issues, among others. She joined the Times of India in 2004. Earlier, Indrani was an associate editor at India Today. She has held fellowships at the Asia Foundation, Oxford University, and the Brookings Institution in Washington, DC. Before I turn to our guests, a couple of housekeeping points. We have over 370 people who have registered for this webinar, and that's only on Zoom. We also have a whole range of people from different parts of the world on YouTube. Hence, it will be very difficult for us to accept voice questions. However, as the speakers start with their opening remarks and in any part of the webinar, please do pop your questions. If you're on Zoom, on the bottom center, there's an icon called Q&A. Please add your questions there. They will be relayed to me, and I will bring them back to the panelists. Similarly, if you're on YouTube, please add your questions to the comments box, and they will be relayed to me in real time. With that, could I please turn to Ashok for his opening remarks and to perhaps help us frame the debate for the discussion today.
Thank you, Rudra. Thank you, Carnegie, and thank you to your team and my other co-panelists for inviting me here. At the MEA and in the broader Indian diplomatic sort of system, as it were, the COVID-19 crisis has had three implications. One, India's response to the COVID-19 crisis or the coronavirus crisis has been a whole of government, I'd say whole of society approach. The MEA has contributed here, first and foremost in securing supplies, equipment from several countries for the central government here in India and for states. And this has included actually following up on orders in different countries with different individual manufacturers and vendors. Our diplomats have done a Herculean job in ensuring that we have enough masks, enough supplies, enough PPEs, enough ventilators, so on and so forth. And we've had to coordinate across missions with several countries and several manufacturers. Second, of course, related to this is the repatriation of our own citizens who've been stranded abroad because we have not allowed flights so as not to transmit the virus here through the lockdown period. 15,000 or 16,000 odd have already come back. This is only the beginning of the process. Many more will come back. This again has been an all of government approach. The Civil Aviation Ministry, the state governments, the Home Ministry, the Health Ministry, and of course the MEA have all been involved. The second set of issues that has involved the MEA and Indian diplomacy more broadly is sharing our expertise, what we have to spare with our friends and partners. As you mentioned, the Prime Minister spoke about how Indian medicines, especially paracetamol and HCQ, will reach about 123 countries. I think about 100 odd countries have already received those medicines. And this includes neighboring countries as well as countries as far away as the Dominican Republic. And the supplies to the Dominican Republic were a logistical challenge because the medicines went from here to Mumbai by a special flight, from Mumbai to, I think, a city in the US, I think it was Chicago, from there to another city in the US, and from there to the Dominican Republic. At each stage, Indian diplomats followed up and were there to see that the cargo was loaded. So this may sound simple, but actually it was very challenging, sometimes in the middle of the night. In addition, Indian rapid response teams, which of course run by the Defense Ministry, they are military medical teams, have gone to 2 countries, the Maldives and Kuwait. Indian medical assistance teams have gone to several locations in the Indian Ocean to help our friends, to provide supplies. All of this has also kept us busy. And more broadly, we've had engagement on platforms such as this, on net-based or video-based platforms with several partner countries at various levels, at the level of officials, at the level of the minister, at the level of the prime minister, trying to make sense of this new world, because we know COVID will change our world. We are not sure how it will change it, but we do know it will change it, and we're already seeing some changes perhaps emerge before us. I would liken this experience to what happened in 2004 when the tsunami took place. That was a big event, and it changed people's perception of India, because the India of 2004 was not the India of 94 or 84. It coped very well with what was a massive natural catastrophe, the tsunami. It not just managed to look after its own people, it also managed to provide support to neighboring countries. And that changed perceptions about India. In some senses, that is happening here as well, because we have managed to keep our numbers low, both the infection rate and the death numbers. I'm not saying infections have not happened or people have not died, but we have managed to keep it low. We have managed to look after the underprivileged, the poorest of the poor in India. Again, I'm not saying there have not been problems. We have seen migrants having to walk home in some cases, which has been absolutely terrible and tragic. But for every migrant who has had to walk home or who has desperately wanted to make that journey back home, there have been many more who have actually been given shelter and provided 3 meals a day by central government, by state governments, by business groups, by civil society organizations. Thanks to our digital benefit transfer system, a direct benefit transfer system, and a banking system, money has reached several hundred million people. You can argue about the quantum of money. Some people say more should be given. Some people say this is enough. I don't want to go into that. But cash transfers have reached, as far as I understand, 300 million individuals. And I'm not counting the cash transfers for subsidized LPG. But direct cash transfers have reached about 300 million people, which has been appreciated by several countries, because many other countries have had problems coping with just such a mechanism. How do you get money across to people who need it? So these are experiences that have had people asking us questions, have had people noticing the Indian experience. It's not been perfect, far from it. I'm not suggesting everything's been hunky-dory. We have had our failures as well. We have had our setbacks. But broadly, we've coped well. And that has helped us at home. That has also helped us internationally in terms of the way people see us, the way people want to engage with us. So I'd like to stop here for the moment and leave it to the others to take this conversation forward.
Thank you, Ashok. Thank you very much. Suhasini, if I can just turn to you, Ashok talked about we're entering a new world. So I was just wondering, from your vantage point and perspective, could you unpack what this new world looks like, especially with regards to, say, what space, how does India find space between, say, the US and China in what it seems to be an area of intensifying competition, and just your assessment of Indian foreign policy in this time of a health emergency?
Absolutely. And, Ashok has given us such a nice overview of everything that the Ministry of External Affairs has been doing. And I'm sure we will see the goodwill generated and the positive effects of this for some time to come. But I would like to broaden this from, to talk much more about the global themes and what is going to be rethought, particularly where it matters to India. And I have 5 points, so I'll get through them as quickly as possible, and then we can always discuss them. The first is really that the spread of the epidemic itself, the fact that the virus, seems to have originated in China. I think we all agree on that, and has spread to various parts of the world. Has questioned globalization. It's also questioned whether countries can sustain globalization in the post-corona world simply because of the economic challenges. Things of pride, in fact, things that we used to talk about in terms of being connected, in terms of working with the whole world, have become part of the problem in a sense. So the question really, when it comes to the first idea, I would say, which is being rethought for India, is will India turn more protectionist? And regardless of how you read Prime Minister Modi's statement the other day, the fact that he has raised the idea of Atmanirbharta is going to be read in many, many places as India turning more protectionist, India moving away from the more global and multilateral trade pacts. So the question is the economy going to be able to open further given the kind of state we are in right now, and negative growth is expected this year. The second place I'd put it is, foreign policy is always actually a mirror of our domestic priorities. It is how a nation sees itself that the nation is able to then connect with the world. So will our domestic priorities stay the same? And as you pointed out, Rudra, is the world going to change? I think even Ashok said, we don't know whether the world will change post-corona. Are we going to suddenly change all our priorities? But this much is true, that India will need to put more money in healthcare, in access to drugs, to food, to clean water. Or if it doesn't, will it continue to invest in the hard power areas, infrastructure, manufacturing, defense? Those questions are going to be central to how India's foreign policy is then seen in the world. And I'll come back to why that is important. Also questions of where we as a society are going. Are we going to see more authoritarian control simply because the coronavirus and the lockdown require it? And maybe there will be, I hope not, but maybe there will be more lockdowns in the future. Do we look much more closely at privacy issues, or are we turning into a surveillance society in many ways? I think these questions will define us internationally as well. Ashok pointed to the pictures, the images of migrants on the street not having been helped. This is part of our international image today. So our domestic priorities are going to be reflected in our foreign policy priorities. The third is going to be that the lockdown has shown us quite obviously. I think anybody who's looked at the clean skies and the beautiful rivers and the pictures of dolphins coming where nobody's seen them and animals everywhere, it's shown us this is the cost of human pollution, what we are seeing without human pollution in it. So is India now going to change or enhance its policies, what they had committed in the Sustainable Development Goals? And I often say that in the long term, we will have to return to those SDGs, although in the short term, we talk about social distancing goals as SDGs. The fact is, are we going to keep on those policies towards global warming, the commitments we've made, or are we going to look at the falling price of energy and say, look, let's at the moment we can afford the fossil fuel imports. We are going to be able to, in the short term at least, not get back to those SDGs. So this is going to be the third part of how India is going to be seen in the world and how India's own foreign policy will be structured. The fourth, how will India deal with the technology catch-22? And by this, I really mean we have a growing need for jobs in our population. It's going to become even worse after the lockdown is over because we don't really know how the manufacturing industry can restart in the next few months. Will the workforce, which is in any case going to grow because of the Gulf returnees as well, have to battle with the increasing uses of artificial intelligence and technology? Let's be honest, in all this time that we've been working from home, in all the time that, as Ashok said, we've been sitting in webinars like this one, how much are the moneyed sort of, the deciders of where money is spent looking and saying, do I really need the infrastructural costs? Do I really need to spend as much as I used to? And at a lower level, how are we going to deal with the fact that artificial intelligence and technology will take over some of the basic jobs, and more people will actually be out of jobs? Finally, and I know this is going to be defined in more narrow terms as the US-China bipolar rivalry. I would like to turn the whole idea of where the future of global leadership goes by asking, um, what makes the US and China leaders today? I mean, we know we talk about GDP, we know we talk about their defense capabilities, we know we talk about their influence over countries and their abilities to sustain other countries as well. Um, but looking at China's handling of the virus, uh, not just the lack of transparency and where it came from, the fact that China could not contain this, the fact that China had as many cases as it did, and it couldn't certainly protect the world from it. And then looking at how the US's healthcare facilities have and responses have worked out, it really makes me wonder: should we even be looking at these as powers to aspire to? In other words, the US-China rivalry might just be the two of them sort of, you did it first, you did this to me, I'm going to stop talking to you, I'm going to pull out all my money from you. That's fine. But is that the leadership that we should aspire to? And I know I am not going to be in a majority when I say this, but I think the interest in traditional ideas that have been mocked over the years is going to come back. And by those traditional ideas, I mean India's foreign policy as it was articulated way back in 1946. It included Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It also included that much reviled word, non-alignment. It also included the interest in India not being able to progress in the world unless it carries its region with it, and South Asia. And Ashok pointed out how we have worked with South Asia, with Indian Ocean region nations as well. I do think that we will see more of that. I do think we will see more of what is called 50-50-50, which is 50 countries at any given time engaging with each other on 50 different issues in 50 different platforms and coalitions. And we are going to see much more in terms of what are called special purpose alliances. And finally, we will have to look at where the UN will stand. Is India going to strengthen the post-World War II order? Or are we going to actually decide that this has not worked for us? Certainly, it has not given us the leadership we have desired in terms of the UN Security Council, and that the world must, in a sense, look again. You know, I always make this point that in 1840, I think the idea of the brotherhood of man came about. In 1940, the idea of the United Nations came about. Maybe we need to look at a new world order in many places. And I think we do have to ask ourselves, are we going to be able to use this time? Because the time seems to be expanding in terms of just how much of a lockdown we are going to need, how much of a hiatus we're in before we can even get to the idea of what our future is going to look like. Are we going to use this time to think about these ideas? Or are we going to literally go back to the way we were before Corona found us?
Suhasini, thanks so much. I'm going to come back to you in a bit on the US, China, and, you know, in the 1970s, you saw a structural shift in international politics, but that structural shift was about bringing the US and China closer together. Many would argue that what you're seeing today is almost an absolute structural shift. It's not about trade. It's not about COVID. It's not about Wuhan. It's about a much deeper fault line that seems to have strengthened and deepened in this time. So I'm going to come back to that on how India can find space in dealing with these competing interests in themselves. But if I could turn to Vijay Chauthaiwale. Vijay, Suhasini talked about defining the international. You're somebody who's played a key role in helping India define the international. And one of the imperatives of Indian foreign policy in the last 6 years has been that the role played by the Prime Minister in his international engagement, in his physical engagement, whether it's in stadiums in different parts of the world addressing large populations, designs which have been architected by people like you. So what is that role of leadership, and what does that look like in the near future, in an age where travel is going to be difficult, in an age where attending large stadiums is going to be difficult, and diplomacy via large crowds is going to be impossible? So if I could just ask you to start with that before unpacking, what does leadership look to you in this post-COVID era, or this COVID era?
Thanks, Rudra, for inviting me here. And also thanks, Ashok, Indrani, and Suhasini. I'm really privileged to be here with them. you started with a topic of leadership, Rudra, and that is what matters most in today's crisis. Prime Minister Modi, in one of his televised address, referred to the earthquake of Gujarat in 2001. Coincidentally, fortunately or unfortunately, I experienced that earthquake in Ahmedabad. I saw a 10-story building falling in front of me, like a car house of cards. And the way Gujarat revived after that, uh, and the large credit goes to the again leadership of Mr. Modi, who became chief minister immediately after the earthquake. So uh, right now also we are having the similar grave crisis. The only thing is that there is no physical destruction for the good thing now. uh, there is of course the destruction of economy, there is destruction of jobs, destruction of social behavior, but there is no physical destruction like that happened in earthquake. And therefore the leadership of Prime Minister Modi will matter a lot in how the country revives, and his future prime minister leadership will be defined on how India has sailed through this crisis. So far, even though the Western media is not willing to accept it, we have done reasonably well, as Ashok has already said, on various parameters. Going forward, I think there are three things that's likely to happen. One is definitely China vis-a-vis rest of the world, and then there are three parts in it. One is definitely China is on the publicity overdrive of that how good they are, one in managing the spread of the disease, and two as a good international responsible international player, and also trying to build the bridges with various political and semi-political institutions across the globe. Number two, China-US relation, especially in the context of November election in US, will also influence a lot on the dynamics. And third, which is equally important, is that the Chinese model of very aggressive diplomacy and investments across the globe through their Belt and Road initiatives, etc., will also be increasingly under question mark in the future to come. Now, India, when a lot of people have started discussing when Prime Minister used the word Atmanirbhar as a kind of isolationist or protectionist approach of Indian foreign policy, but that is exactly opposite. And to give you some statistics, Prime Minister Modi in last 2 months has done more than 45 bilateral talks, and 3 or 4 multilateral. Dr. Jaishankar has carried out more than 60 bilateral talks, and just yesterday there was a talk between him and foreign ministers of Nordic countries. So our engagement with the rest of the world is going to be as vigorous, if not more, and there is no sign at all to say that it will be less vigorous. And that is the way it has to be. Of course, the mode of the discussion will be different because India's needs and priorities are likely to change a lot in a post-epidemic, because we need to be little bit more independent or self-reliant on various raw material, various finished products also, and excessive dependence on one country is definitely not going to be useful. We have seen what has happened in the developed countries like UK or US, where they couldn't even produce the PPEs, and the stocks coming out of other countries were found to be substandard. And that situation cannot go in the pandemic emergency situation, and also not during the normal situation. So some amount of self-reliance and collaborative reliance, where there is a give and take rather than one is excessively exporter and other is excessively dependent on one country. That model has to change. There is absolutely no question about it, and we will have to change our policies, our statutes also to an extent to support these people. Third part is going to be that science and technology is going to play an enormous role, and India is it has its inherent strength, is likely to play a dominant role in this respect. Everyone is now looking at India for maybe the only mass manufacturer of vaccine doses across the globe, because only India has that capacity, and we should leverage it, not in the exploitative manner, but also really in a good spirit of collaboration and cooperation, which India is famous for. As far as India's diaspora is concerned, wherever they are doing a great job in helping local communities, helping local institutions in a both service mode and also in their professional way. Hundreds of doctors, literally thousands of doctors in US are fighting COVID epidemic or treating COVID patients, and some of them even succumbed to death. Same is true in UK and many other parts of the world. India has launched one of the largest, or maybe the largest, rescue operation where more than 200,000 people would be it would be bringing back to India in next month or so, and the complexity is unimaginable. Even though the largest such an operation was from Kuwait, but and it was also a big one, but it was from single destination. And here we are now talking about some 45, 50 destinations and 10 to 12 destinations in India. So it's a highly complex operation which India is undergoing. And eventually, I would say that India's image will come as a very responsible country in this dynamics, and therefore India's stature will also go up. Overall, how, in what form, it is yet to be defined and it is yet to be seen. But I am pretty optimistic about India's engagement with the rest of the world. Of course, we need to give up some old nostalgia, which some of which Suhasini has mentioned, and we cannot build upon it. We will have to build the new models of cooperation, and even though the principle of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam remains same, the context will change in the time to come. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of the tensions in the old nostalgias. But before I move to Indrani, if I can just ask you, Vijay, is in the next year or year and a half, what does the next Madison Square Garden or what does the next Wembley look like? And
I have no plan.
Okay. Okay. So if I can just turn to Indrani. Indrani, Vijay talked about leadership and stature, and I was just wondering, closer to home in the neighborhood, what does that stature look like, and what does the role of leadership look like? And we've got a couple of questions, quite interestingly, about few people writing in to say is that a lot of it's being made about Indian assistance abroad in Africa to India's South Asian neighbors. Isn't this also an opportunity to perhaps open a bridge with Pakistan to provide assistance and medical supplies? Indrani, I think you're on mute.
Yes. Hi, Rudra, and thank you very much, and thank you, Carnegie, for organizing this. Then the terrible thing about coming in last is that everybody said almost everything you want to say. But thank you for taking the conversation to the neighborhood. And let me begin by saying one thing that I think as India, we haven't done too badly in the last couple of months. And I think every speaker has touched on it. We haven't done too badly in managing the COVID issue. I mean, we have of course hit 80,000 cases, which is about what China had. I would say, without being snarky, that our reporting is actually probably much more true to the actual numbers than the Chinese. However, we do look at COVID as an inflection point in our current history, and we do believe that the world will change in certain ways. In many other ways, the world will remain the same. Our strategic priorities are not going to change. Our strategic priorities will remain the same. And how do we approach these priorities? How do we approach our policies? The tools may change, the instruments may change. We will remain a pole in the world, and I see the world becoming more and more of a multipolar system. We will not. I have to say that I don't think we will play that. We will play in that mid space between the US and China. We will definitely take sides, and we will make choices. Some of those choices will be choices that we have never made before. I look at multilateral, smaller plurilateral groupings that I see organically sprouting, and as George Bush called them, the coalitions of the willing. And I look at coalitions of the willing sprouting even today. I mean, just look at the Indo-Pacific dialogue that the Foreign Secretary is holding, a similar Indo-Pacific dialogue that the Foreign Minister has been holding, with the Quad as the core backbone of these conversations or these groupings. Obviously, the conversation is about COVID and etc. But coming back much closer home, as you said, Rudra, what does it look like for our region? Well, I think India has been a first responder in many ways. We have been out there with assistance, with medicines, with medical teams, what have you, similar to the kind of assistance that we provided in 2004. Of course, this time we are playing to our strengths because we are a pharmaceutical giant, and we have been using our ability to produce medicines that are necessary to fight COVID at this point, and been very generous with it to our neighbors. Having said that, does that change the politics of the region? No, I do not believe it does. We will continue to have the relationship with Pakistan as we have today. The idea that COVID has stopped terror from Pakistan is ludicrous. I mean, you just have to see infiltration levels in the valley to know that. If we've all been watching the whole Islamophobia story that played out in the Gulf states a few weeks ago, actually, and part of that was some part of it was some part of disinformation campaigns that was carried out. Part of it, of course, willingly done by people of India behaving in a way that does actually impact our image overseas, does actually impact our foreign policy, and does impact how we see ourselves as a nation. But that apart, is this a time to reach out to Pakistan? Why? Why? I mean, I do not see the reason why. We do not have a lessening of any of the problems that we did with Pakistan. So I'm not sure that this is the right time. If Pakistan wants to reach out, I think India will be today, as it has always been, a partner. But I do believe that the national, or let's say the public opinion against terror is much harder than ever. Government policy against terror much harder than ever. I don't see them going anywhere. So while we may be getting into a new world, I think a lot of the old world will continue to come along with us. And how we deal with that? Some of our tools will remain the same. There's no getting away from that. So yes, we are at this point. We have border incursions by China in Ladakh and in Sikkim. We have a war of words, if you will, with Nepal on border issues. So those issues are not going away. However, we have expanded our region, we have expanded our neighborhood, and I see the kind of work that we are doing in the eastern seaboard of Africa, in the Indian Ocean, in South Central Indian Ocean, to be sort of a sign of things to come. We will be looking more and more outward. So as Suhasini said, our technologies, our sort of supply chains, etc., will work, and those supply chains will have to change, because one of the things that this pandemic has taught us, and has not just us, has taught pretty much every country, that when you cannot source something as simple as personal protection equipment or N95 masks for your healthcare workers, you have to take a serious look at how you deal with manufacturing. In India, I would say, and I have written this, that we have been following the China manufacturing model, which comes from the Indian government's love for a ridiculous thing called L1, which is go for the cheapest. And go for the cheapest, go for the worst, and therefore you go for Chinese manufacturing. There is no other way out. So if today there is a sense of some degree of economic nationalism, we are not unique. We are not even alone in the world looking at a degree of economic nationalism. I actually date this to the time when India said no to RCEP. India will continue to say no to RCEP because the conditions that that prompted India to say no to RCEP in November continue today. So if you're looking forward at manufacturing or at supply chains, I would say that the kind of taut global supply chains that we had pre-pandemic, pre-COVID, will no longer work. There will be a degree, or there will be a set of critical industries in every country that will be domestic, that will be homegrown. There will be CFIUS-like bodies growing in every country. I noticed that even the Danes put out a committee that would screen investments, particularly from China. Of course, we came in late, and the Americans had come in last year with CFIUS. But I see this happening in more and more countries. So does that make the future of international sort of politics, or say international economics, into a sort of a Hobbesian world? I don't think so. I do believe, however, that trust will play a greater factor in both setting up manufacturing supply chains as well as technology. It is not for nothing that we are saying that country after country will be saying no to China's Huawei in their 5G infrastructure. Where we are, I have no idea, because we are still in 4G. But I do believe that countries will be protecting themselves more and more from predatory buying, from the kind of mercantilist economics that is practiced by China. I will stop here and happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Indrani. I'm going to now, we've got a whole bunch of questions, almost 35. So I'm going to club them in different bits. The first club, I'm going to come back to perhaps, Indrani, some of the questions around different platforms by which you could extend your foreign policy. So whether that's SAARC, whether it's NAM, whether it's BIMSTEC, and different ways in which this is being reimagined today, perhaps. But we've got a bunch of questions from Jairam Shah, Khalid Iqbal, Ambassador Suresh Goel, and Tanvi Madan, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, is essentially about the US and China. And Ashok, if I can ask you, is on the US and China, it seems very clearly now that we're in a place of what Evan Feigenbaum calls managed enmity. This is not strategic competition any longer. At some level, many would argue that the Indian government could, or as some of our questioners have argued, could sit on the fence. It could wait it out, try and see where the best opportunities lie. But at some point, India is going to be pushed to actually having to make a choice in this world that is going to become a lot starker. So where is the government and where is the MEA with regards to, say, Sino-Indian relations at this time of structural shift? Sorry, Ashok, I think you're on mute.
Rudra, it's not as if countries have to make one dramatic choice. They have to make choices every day. They have to make several choices. So let me go back to some of the issues that were addressed by the others on globalization and where it stands. What the coronavirus crisis has done is that it's accentuated some of the trends that already existed before coronavirus. As Indrani pointed out, the pushback against full-scale globalization was coming for some years now. The full-scale globalization has lifted many hundreds of millions, including in India, out of poverty. It has also hollowed out manufacturing in many countries, including India. It has also led to unrestricted financial flows that have played havoc with financial markets in many countries and have hurt them. So there was always a pushback coming. And there are constituencies in many countries which say that, look, you need to have a certain degree of manufacturing. You have to have a certain degree of stake for domestic constituencies, stakeholders, citizens to make economic growth of this global nature viable. Even in the current context, the idea, as Indrani pointed out with using the L1 example, that if I run short of a critical commodity at home, the market will mysteriously fill the gap by reaching out to the cheaper supplier, who probably is in Asia or China or Vietnam or wherever, and magically provide me my goods. That lazy assumption has been caught napping in this global crisis. Obviously, global supply chains will be reworked, will be diversified. I don't think it's a question of everyone moving out to China. That's not possible either. China is 1/5 of the global economy. It will remain a powerful economy. Even we need to sell to China and buy from China. But there will be a diversification of supply chains, and people will build in internal and domestic redundancies for critical goods. When you're talking about, for example, diversifying health supply chains, people have spoken about it in the context of the Indo-Pacific group and several other groups. India has to ask itself, if you repurpose these supply chains into plurilateral supply chains, for instance, for specific needs such as health, what does India bring to the table? It's fine to say India is the pharmacy of the world, but we have to provide to a proper health security supply chain. We have to provide more than just paracetamols and cheap drugs. We can't say we will not provide PPEs because we don't make them. We can't say we won't provide ventilators because we don't make them. We can't say we won't provide diagnostic kits because we don't make them. Because then you'll move from import dependency from China to import dependency from another country. So if you have restructured and diversified supply chains, India has to bring something to the table, and something beyond just cheap generic medicines. So for instance, if you look at PPEs, at the beginning of the COVID crisis, India was not making any PPEs. Today, 35 companies are. Many of them are garments or textile companies that have repurposed supply chains to start making PPEs. Some of them will go back to making raincoats or hats or shirts or whatever in a few weeks or a few months. I have no doubt about that. But some of them will say, hang on, there's a market here. There's a domestic market. There's an international market. Let's stick to PPEs, or let's make that part of our portfolio. The same will happen with ventilators. The same will happen with several pieces of equipment, but not all. And that will make for a more wholesome Indian economy. That will make India more self-reliant. It will also make India more international or internationalist, because we'll have more to sell, and therefore it will be easier for us to also buy more. Not just in terms of money, but also in terms of the political capital to go out there and say, okay, we are importing enough, we are exporting enough, so we can import as well. That political capital is not available under the current globalization model.
I'm going to move to Vijay and the others in a second on diversification. But if I can just ask you one question. Do you think today, given the nature of the crisis and the need to be part of more markets less rather than less markets, it was a mistake for India to step out of RCEP?
You know, we looked at RCEP very closely. Various specialists in the government did, the Commerce Ministry did, the Prime Minister and his office did. Our experience with the trade pacts we entered in the early part of the 21st century has almost uniformly seen a hollowing out of whatever manufacturing we had. And at a time when our Make in India program is just about moving from, level 1 to level 2 and has to reach level 10. It's got miles to go. I think it was a good decision. And if anything, the COVID experience and the experience of countries which have been overly dependent on imports from China or from one country would have reinforced and revalidated the decision to stay out of RCEP.
Okay. Thanks, Ashok. Vijay, if I can just turn to you about this question of diversification. We have a range of questions from L.K. Singhania, Praveena Rai, Ajay Khanti, and Sudeep Mukhia. And essentially, they seem to be asking this question of, it's one thing to say that India can benefit from supply chain diversification, but do we actually have the policies in India to absorb the kind of businesses and manufacturing and industries that are in time going to be unplugged from China? And one example is, until December 2019, 59 companies, American companies, had left China. 22 went to Vietnam. 2 at the bottom end of the value chain came to India. So the Prime Minister made an ambitious announcement the other day. He talked about economic reforms, but that's going to take time. So how does India find economic space at this time to keep the balance between self-reliance on the one hand, which is what you and Ashok and Indrani have talked about, and the need also to trade, given also the fact that half our $2.7 trillion economy comes from external factors? How do you reach that balance? Sorry, Vijay, I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Rudra, you have asked a very pertinent question. These policies need to be changed. Some of them are outdated and we need to bring new light into it. And this is a very good opportunity for us to make some drastic changes in our major policy of land, like land reforms, etc. And I'm sure government is thinking about it. But at the same time, there will be some low-hanging fruits which we can bring immediately. Invest India portal, if you see the number of queries they have receiving in last 2 months, is significantly higher, multiple times higher than what they used to receive. There is renowned interest in India because the kind of bandwidth India can offer, not many countries can offer in terms of land, space, manpower, skilled manpower, etc. And therefore, I am reasonably optimistic that if not everything which is coming out of China, a significant chunk will come to India in due course of time. But of course, we need to prepare ourselves for that.
Okay, thank you, Vijay. And if I can, ask you also, Vijay, you're a person who is deeply tied to pharmaceuticals, to R&D. Health diplomacy is an area that you've worked on for more than a decade of your life. We keep talking about health diplomacy. Ashok said at some point we need to get beyond providing medicines and paracetamol to other countries. What does health diplomacy look like today, for instance? So the scientific lobby would argue that the kind of cooperation that you need within India and between India and other countries to actually come to some kind of a solution when it comes to COVID-19 is not actually there in practice. That we hold back, we don't share, whether it's best practices, whether it's samples or data. So I was just wondering, is that we're seeing much more of the old come into play today rather than a shock coming to the system which allows us to think about new ways of cooperating?
See, it's quite a complex issue you have touched, and Ashok has rightly said that the low-hanging fruits of simple generic medicine are reaching its peak, and beyond the point, more value addition to that is likely difficult and more challenging, because now even if you see US generic market, out of 10 generic companies, 7 are Indians which are competing with each other, and they are competing for every penny per tablet in the price term. So this cannot go on for a long period of time. Of course, it is very important market. It has given a lot of impetus to Indian pharma industry, But at the end, it will be what will be important is that how much innovation we can do in that sector, in terms of biologicals, in terms of biosimilars, in terms of innovative drugs, in terms of devices, in terms of telemedicine and remote care, robotics, all these new field Indian healthcare sector will have to enter in order to gain again its advantage as we have got over the generic medicine. So it's not an easy path. Of course, paracetamol and HCQ are important, and they will remain important for even after the COVID, because the population in the world will require medicines, and 80-90% of them will be generic medicines. So I'm not discounting the generic market; they are very important. But if you want to go to the next orbit, if you then the innovation will be the only key to do that.
Thanks, Vijay. So, Asini, if I can just turn to you, it's interesting when we diagnose Indian foreign policy, there seems to be a lot more of the old under new conditions rather than detecting newer trends in themselves. So let me just ask you a blunt question: what are the challenges to India which are acuter today than they were in the past? I think you're on mute, Suhasini.
I think the challenges to India, and you could argue these are global challenges, are threefold. One, that India is essentially, finding its place in a world, as I said, of this leadership, where you are dealing with a global power post the Second World War, i.e. the United States, in serious retrenchment. You can say what you like about American bluster around the world. You can say what you like about the fact that we are getting into all these great partnerships with the US in the Indo-Pacific and all the rest of that. But in reality, where is the US actually increasing its imprint? It is, in fact, pulling away from its imprint. It is pulling out of every war it is a part of, regardless of the impact that it has. It is also pulling out of its interest in the world in many ways. It has pulled out of its funding of the United Nations. It has pulled out of its funding of the WHO as well. It has pulled out of UNESCO and UN Human Rights Council. These things have an impact on the global order. And finally, it has pulled out of deals and agreements that it had itself signed on to, like the Paris Accord and like the JCPOA with Iran. So you're looking at a US which is essentially in retrenchment. The second challenge I would say is that you are looking at China, which is behaving in ways that even those who had predicted its aggressive rise had not expected. The kind of incidents that Indrani has pointed to, even though our army chief has gone out to say, and the army, the COS has said in his statement, this has nothing to do with global and regional events. I don't think you can discount the idea that 4 serious skirmishes of some sort, I mean, we know that people were injured. We know that, as they say, 2 armies were very aggressive with each other. I don't understand what that means, really. Did they both charge at each other at exactly the same time without a purpose? Somebody was the aggressor in that. That you're seeing these 4 incidents in quick succession means something. It also means something that China is a real part of South Asia today. In a way, I don't think we were talking about even 5 years ago, Rudra. We were talking about the possibility of China taking over. Today, the Indian Army chief seems to suggest that Nepal is taking on India on a border dispute at the behest of another power. I cannot stress enough whether it is Nepal, whether it is Bangladesh, whether it is Sri Lanka, whether it is the Maldives, and we're not even talking about Pakistan here, the kind of entrenchment of China that is a challenge to India. And I think the third big challenge for India is going to be, as I said, dealing with the repercussions of the technology versus dealing with the reality of India. I mean, we can keep talking about technology as much as we want, unless we're finding jobs, and not just jobs, but jobs that actually use the talents of our people, not the kind of jobs where you have 500,000 people who are graduates or MBAs applying for very, very unskilled jobs in the government. Until we're dealing with that and not behaving like we're some world power because of the numbers we can show, we need to deal with these three challenges, if you ask me, straight away. And it's okay to say that we don't have all the answers. India's position in the world, its goodwill in the world, and there is goodwill for India in no matter which continent you go to, does not depend on this idea of India's power or India's leadership. It depends on the idea of consensus, on the fact of what India has built over so many decades as an idea of India. So I really do think that we need to leverage that in order to now deal with these three challenges that I mentioned. And I would say that of all of them, the US in retrenchment, the China getting more entrenched, that's something we're going to deal with. As you said, these are old problems that keep finding new ways. But the immediate problem is going to be occupying our large population today.
So I'm going to come to the US in a second, and I'm going to bring Indrani in. But Ashok, if I can just come back to you and ask you perhaps now a more uncomfortable question, given the position you hold, is so one of the common denominators in Suhasini's three challenges, whether it's technology, whether it's infrastructural investments in the changing nature of South Asia, Chinese infrastructure investment, is China. So how would you characterize at the moment India's relationship with China? Vijay earlier gave what I thought was actually quite a sober view on China, quite a balanced view, which is to say is that essentially from what I could get out of it, Vijay, was that you need to work with China where you can, and where you need to hold China accountable, work internationally to do so. But how would you characterize India's relationship with China, given the assertiveness that is clear?
It's not very different from, I'm not going to say anything different from what Vijay said, because he's more or less said what is a commonsensical position. He has stated a commonsensical position. We have differences with China. We have disagreements with China. We have border disagreements. We have trade disagreements. We've had problems of market access. Our markets have been very accessible to China, to Chinese investment, to Chinese goods, to Chinese infrastructure companies. In fact, it's led to a dependency which is almost a security concern now for some. But Chinese markets have not been accessible for Indian pharmaceutical manufacturers, Indian dairy product exporters, Indian IT companies. They have just not been. And the Prime Minister has been trying ever since he came to office in 2014. His predecessor tried as well. This Prime Minister has really tried, but we remain exactly where we were. With some exceptions here and there. One contract is opened up to an Indian pharmaceutical company, but that's it. Those problems remain. Internationally, in multilateral institutions, we haven't got much space from China. They've chosen not to see our point of view at the NSG and in the UN. With the Belt and Road Initiative and the CPEC, which is a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, as you know, CPEC, of course, is being built on land, on territory we see as our own, which is Indian territory. But quite apart from that, even the other BRI projects in our neighborhood, Chinese investments or Chinese debt-based projects have ended up creating unviable projects and have ended up creating some sort of a political and social instability in many countries that has had to be managed by India in the broader sense, because this is our neighborhood, and that is a concern. These issues remain. However, the fact is, in the coming years, you will see more China than you did, say, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. That's a reality. We have to work with them, and the whole idea that two powers are rising at the same time next to each other. China has risen much more than we have, but we're on that road as well. Is fairly new to the world. Russia and the US grew at other ends of the world. They met only near the North Pole. So we have to have more conversations. The informal dialogue that the Prime Minister has with President Xi has not led to any blockbuster trade deal or blockbuster border agreement. It was never supposed to. It's supposed to have the two countries have a conversation to understand how they think. And at the end of it, agree to disagree, or agree that they will disagree, perhaps on many issues, but just talk that much more. So we have to manage our differences, but there will be differences.
Ashok, just one question. Were you surprised with the skirmishes on the border? If I'm not mistaken, the set of skirmishes was perhaps the most serious, and I say serious, quote unquote, since for a few years now, certainly since 2017.
I guess for many years, the border between the contested border, if you will, between India and China was genuinely desolate because it was inaccessible for both armies. Both areas that were claimed by India, and of course, the Chinese have their own claim, as well as what was the de facto frontier or line of actual control. Those areas were not accessible to to both armies or military personnel from both countries. The Chinese built infrastructure and began making a presence in the region. Under this government in the past 5 years, India has also built capacities. So you are actually seeing Indian troops in places where the Chinese have not seen them earlier. I'm not suggesting these areas are Chinese areas. These are very much Indian. This is very much Indian territory, and this is very much territory on our side of the line of actual control. But it's just that the Chinese have not been used to seeing Indians there, and that is new.
So, Indrani, if I could just turn to you, we have a question from Air Vice Marshal Manmohan Bahadur, and he asked the basic question is that if Trump were to lose the elections this year, where does this put us? Many would argue that India has put or placed many of its eggs or all of its eggs in the Trump basket. So how would that affect our relations with the United States going ahead? It's a hypothetical, it's a counterfactual, so we can make what we want of the question, but how would India deal with this? And perhaps you could just give your reflections on how do you see the US-India relationship in itself?
I think the US-India relationship, frankly, I don't see Joe Biden is no stranger to India. India is no stranger to Joe Biden. And you may not have the bluster that we see with Trump. I do believe that Biden will continue, say, certainly the policies on China. I don't see them changing because I watched public opinion, or at least Washington opinion on China change quite dramatically over the last few years. I think the US-India relationship, frankly, has an energy of its own. We have, it sort of worked step by step since, at least since I've been covering it since Bill Clinton, frankly. We've had, Clinton was a certain kind of president. We had a different relationship with George Bush, again, not in his first term, definitely in his second term. And with Obama, again, we didn't have a great relationship in the first term and a more realistic relationship in the second term. With Trump, we've had a particularly good relationship in his first term. I honestly don't see a lot changing. If you think that the Democrats will hold it against India because Modi held a Trump, an event with Trump in Houston and an event with Trump in Ahmedabad. Whoever is here, then Modi or somebody else will hold the same event with Biden in Ahmedabad and in Houston or wherever it is that they might hold. So I don't actually see, because it's not really just the personalities that make a difference. I believe that there are converging interests on both sides, and the converging interests come because the rest of the world is changing. Our interests are growing, and in many ways, our interests are aligning with American interests. Those interests will continue to align. In fact, I would say that Biden might take a tougher line in Afghanistan. If you remember, as vice president, Biden was the man who did the counterterrorism plus policy was his policy. Could that come back in Afghanistan? Perhaps, and that would not be unwelcome where India is concerned. So I mean, it is hypothetical, as you said, but so it's not. So I don't actually see too much of a problem. I do, however, want to comment on the health diplomacy that you raised a little while ago, which is where we seem to have stopped at HCQs and paracetamol, and I believe it's actually much bigger than that. Part of it will come in the restructuring of the WHO, and it's not only the US that wants that a reform in the WHO. I think the Prime Minister himself, Prime Minister Modi himself, has put this out in the public domain during his G20 summit address, where he said that we are looking at a reform of the WHO. Now, what does that reform include? I don't know. Does it include a more transparent working system? Does it include better reporting, better WHO accountability with in the certainly in the developing world? I don't know. It may well be that, but I do believe that might be one of the places where we would be looking at reforming the multilateral system. And yes, I think the multilateral system needs to be changed. Whatever else we may or may not say, the fact is that we have been crying ourselves hoarse for the last 50 years that the UN system is not something that we would like to sort of sign on to. We don't even want to sign on to the current WTO system. We would like to see the WTO also reformed. Of course, the UN, we want to see it reformed. So multilateralism itself, I think, will be the place where we will see the greatest amount of change. So health diplomacy in this case could segue into a reform of the multilateral system.
So Indrani, can I just ask you very quickly, were you surprised, pleased, unsurprised that the Prime Minister took the NAM meeting? Vijay talked a little bit earlier about older ideologies, older ideas. And it's interesting is in this particular crisis, the one term that we haven't heard at all is BRICS. It's got a bank, but it seems to be non-existent when it comes to our understanding of regionalism, international institutionalism. But SARC, NAM...
There was a BRICS foreign ministers conference. There was a BRICS foreign ministers conference.
Okay. But how do you see that, Indrani?
So now, my sense is the Prime Minister was doing the NAM meeting not because it was NAM. He was doing the NAM meeting because that is part of the kind of extensive diplomacy that he has been doing, which is reaching out to everybody. NAM just happened to be a platform which has X number of countries. And as far as I have seen this government for the past 6 years, I have not seen any affinity, let's say, with NAM ideals or NAM principles. So my sense is he just used it as a slightly cynical, but he just used it as a platform. To be honest, I was surprised, and I thought it was unnecessary. I mean, he could have reached out separately. So I don't think that was a necessary meeting. But yes, they did BRICS. I mean, they've just been doing meeting after meeting with every kind of formulation out there. In my view, not such a great idea, but it keeps them occupied, I suppose.
Okay, thanks. And I stand corrected. Tanvi Madan just messaged me to say is that the BRICS Bank, the NDB, has given $1 billion to India on loan, which I did not know about. So clearly that's quiet diplomacy, effective diplomacy that's still working, and BRICS is still up and up. So if I can just slowly returning a couple of minutes to concluding this webinar, but Suhasini, if I can just ask you so we're talking about reform multilateralism. we've been talking about the UN, we've talked about UN Security Council reform, we've talked about the WHO for quite some time. There's clearly an urgency at the moment. But yet these are still seem to be the status quo multilateral institutions, right? Yeah. So whether it's the World Bank, whether it's IMF, whether it's the WHO, the Bretton Woods system seems to be alive whether we like it or not, right? So what does that restructuring actually look like? Where does that impetus actually come from in real terms?
It's interesting that you say so, but I mean, we do have to come back to the same, the point I was trying to make earlier, that look, we can knock any of these ideas, and certainly I agree with Indrani in the sense that the non-aligned movement hardly is the same thing as non-alignment. The non-aligned movement is today people with a very different set of countries in a very different place in their own global position than they were perhaps in the 50s and 60s. But you're not going to get a better answer. I'll put it to you. Is there anybody in this panel or otherwise who believes that an alliance with the United States is going to see us through? I would think not. And I will ask a basic question. Indrani spoke about Afghanistan just now. The truth is that you can have as close a relationship and as close an understanding with the United States as you like, and yet you cannot convince them of what your interests in Afghanistan are. You cannot convince them of who they should really be. I mean, we have an amazing statement today from the US that essentially is almost saying that forces other than the Taliban are trying to wreck US-Taliban relations and the peace accord, and more or less letting the Taliban off the hook when it comes to terrorism over there. So you have this kind of situation, and I'm just using a small example, but I do remember that the External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, when he was Foreign Secretary, made a very interesting point once where he said that our problem with an alliance with the US will remain the same, that what they want from us he was doing it with his arm, so he said to the right of us, what he meant was the east of us, is very different from what we want from them to the left of us, or to the west of us. And until you can bring these kind of contradictions, if you like, together, we're not looking at an open alliance with the United States. We also have to deal with this 3,000-kilometer land boundary with China, which will make it very much more difficult if we were to enter into such an alliance. So my question would be, if we are not going with the polls of the day, and Russia is not quite the same is in the same position today, perhaps, then what are we talking about? We're talking about special purpose alliances. We're talking about reinventing, if you like. I mean, you can say that these are old ideas, but I think what we are going to see is much more of these special purpose alliances, as I said, 50-50-50. We will have a coalition with certain countries when we're dealing with the Indo-Pacific. We'll have coalitions with other countries when we're dealing with the Indian Ocean region, for example, where we don't really want to see either the US or China in the same strength. We will have a different coalition when it comes to climate change, and although we didn't act out on those common interests, the fact is China and India did have many common interests when it came to the Paris agreements. We'll have an alliance with other countries. I think one thing I find that is interesting, and I'll leave it over there, is that everybody who used to give us lectures years ago about realpolitik is today talking to us about ideological reasons not to get into this relationship or not to get into that relationship. So we have to decide if India's interests are paramount, then that is what will decide each of our alliances. And I think this idea that we must, corner somebody, and this has been, even a policy, or not just on China but on Pakistan. The idea that we will corner somebody because we have zero common interests with them, or that we will stand with somebody else despite having a different view. It doesn't work in the real world. In the real world, we will work according to India's interests on each of these issues, and every other country will as well. So I know I'm not saying anything new. I'm just saying that these are going to be the parameters, regardless of how you look at them. And yes, I do think, Rudra, that the real shift has to be, and I know it sounds like a lot of UN speak and a lot of, lip flap, but the real shift is not going to be about whether we get closer to the US or whether we put China on the map or any of those. The real shift is going to be, are we going to change our own priorities when it comes to putting money into countering global warming, when it comes into putting money into food security, into bioethics, into technology for the poor, into bridging the digital divide? Are these things we are going to put money into, or are we going to just follow? Because eventually, money will decide where our future lies, and or are we going to put our money into the hard power aspects of, defense and manufacturing and investments and infrastructure and all the rest? I'm not saying that we don't need those. I'm just saying that we really need to find new priorities, which hopefully the coronavirus pandemic will kind of necessitate.
So just to pivot to the last question, I'm going to ask one set of questions, and I'm going to be slightly unfair about this to Vijay, Ashok, and Indrani, and then I'm going to pivot to Suhasini, a different one. So Vijay, Ashok, and Indrani, if there was one area that you would identify in the last 50 or 60 days that you think the Indian government could have done better when it comes to foreign policy, where perhaps it failed, where it missed a trick, where it was not up to speed, what would that be? So Vijay perhaps, then Ashok, and then Indrani. Vijay, I think you're on mute.
I think if we would have talked to our friendly countries earlier about a joint strategy of combating COVID, not only we would have benefited more, but others also would have benefited.
Okay, thank you, Vijay. Ashok?
It's not for me to judge what the ministry I work in is doing. It's for others to judge. But I think Vijay has a point. The multilateral system has, as we've discussed through this discussion, through this session, has been under stress for some time. And frankly, while it needs reform, I can also see it losing some of its strength, even or losing even more of its strength in the eyes of many countries after this crisis. In the early days of the crisis, it was almost like a zero-sum game. Each country was thinking for itself. It wasn't just seeking equipment for itself, but it was actually thinking for itself. And it wasn't exchanging ideas. This is not just an Indian problem. It was actually, we wanted more international discussion. But many countries just looked at it very differently. And perhaps we got to know about the enormity of the problem from the country where it started, China, much later than we perhaps should have. And we took early steps, and we were told you're taking steps too early, these are not needed. In the end, perhaps we were right. But that the degree of international cooperation and sort of lesson learning and lesson sharing, that was a gap which I think many countries felt.
Thank you, Ashok. Indrani, in 2024, India is going to be in election mode. In fact, we're possibly going to be in election mode much before that. Keeping the current crises as a framework, what is the narrative going to look like for India three or 4 years from now, as we go into elections and the polls?
Couple of things. One is how well did we bring the economy back post-COVID? How well did we do with the millions who have been out of a job, out of home, disadvantaged in every possible way within India? How did we manage the diplomacy relating to health, but how did we manage our power? And that we do, though that is hard power. This is not in multilateral relations, etc. It is, if COVID presents us an opportunity to expand our power, comprehensive national power? Did we expand it? Did we use those opportunities? Or did we fail? Or did we get confused in the minutiae and fail to see the bigger picture, or fail to see where we should be going and did not get there? I would say that those would be the questions that we would be answering in 2024.
Thank you, Indrani. And Suhasini, for you, is the British historian A.J.P. Taylor once wrote a book called Troublemakers. Many would argue in the analytical field that you are something of a troublemaker for governments. You have held governments to account through your writings across the board, like many others have, like Indrani has. And you've kept us straight in the narrow. But if you were to pick out one example or a set of examples where you've been surprised by the positive way in which the Indian government has reacted to COVID-19, what would those be? Suhasini, I think you're on mute.
Okay, I won't say I'm surprised, because I think it is the most natural thing, but the way the government has moved when it came to the neighborhood is something that restores one's faith in one's traditional positions. The fact is that India did not ask, India did not say, sometimes we've often even given more than somebody has asked for, and there have been weird times in which we said we're sending a military rapid response team to countries around, and they said, no, we don't need a military team over here. But the truth is that is actually something that India has done very much from the gut. And I think Prime Minister Modi's decision to organize the SARC meeting early on to talk about COVID is a very important instinct, because I think it came from instinct. It wasn't necessarily some grand strategy, because as we've seen, we've been part, as Indrani said, of so many different strategies. But with the SARC countries, it's amazing that India, that has not taken part in one summit, since 2014, and as a result, there's been no summit, decided that in this case, we are all actually together. There's no question that Pakistan, through its kind of, very petty politicking, didn't necessarily benefit from the same kind of feeling. But that's there. And I do want to make the point when you say, what is it that we could have done? I think it's necessary, and I'm not in any way saying that the government's efforts have not been recognized. It's necessary for us to recognize that somehow South Asia has not faced, and not yet, we're some 80 days into the pandemic, or maybe more, and South Asia has not faced the pandemic in quite the same way when it comes to the numbers, and quite the same way when it comes to the mortality or the seriousness of the pandemic. Now, many will say, oh, you've now crossed China in terms of absolute numbers. I'm talking about how many people who have been tested, who within that testing have tested positive. Whether we're seeing the same kind of overwhelming that the US saw within, I think, a few weeks of its healthcare infrastructure, or Italy saw within a few days, or Spain saw it. We have not yet seen that, touch wood, and we hope we don't see it. But I do think that South Asia, and here India has had this very stringent lockdown and everything, but Pakistan certainly has not, and Bangladesh certainly has not. We've seen these huge rallies and things over there. Sri Lanka is already out of its lockdown. So there must be something that's keeping South Asia in a way, or South Asians, somehow as a distinct population, as opposed to, say, Iran on one side and all the rest. And I think these studies are important. The World Bank has just put $40 million, I think. It's not a huge amount, but it's a start into just studying these kind of things, where South Asia as a region has so much in common that it would be foolish if we come out of the coronavirus pandemic without a better sense of each other, whether it's climate change, healthcare, even the problem of migrants, because South Asian migrants are the largest migrant population. If we could work together rather than competing with each other, we see new realities form. So to put it straight, I think what the government did with the SARC and with handing out this, not just aid, but assistance, sending teams into South Asian countries has been absolutely, it almost reaffirms that this is where our instinct lies.
I think the three common words that seem to emerge over here is partnership, leadership by partnership, bridging power, and instinct. Let's see how these words test for themselves in the near future. But for now, Vijay Chauthaiwale, Ashok Malik, Indrani Bagchi, Suhasini Haidar, thank you very much for joining us on India and the World. And for the audiences from different parts of the world, thank you very much. And thanks for keeping me straight on the narrow with factual checks and WhatsApps coming in and other things. And we look forward to having you on India and the World again on the 28th of this month. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Rudra. Thank you, Carnegie. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.